The look on my brother's face when I pulled out that property deed will haunt him forever. Standing there in front of 43 family members at our annual reunion, he had just announced that I didn't belong on the family land anymore. What he didn't know was that I owned every acre beneath his feet. The silence that followed my revelation was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and watching his smug expression crumble into pure panic was worth every sleepless night I'd endured over the past 6 months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Chen, and at 31 years old, I thought I had finally found my place in this complicated world. As a certified public accountant with my own practice in downtown Portland, I had built a life that made sense to me, even if it never seemed to make sense to my family. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very skills they dismissed as boring number crunching would eventually become the weapon that dismantled their carefully constructed house of lies. Growing up as the middle child in the Morrison family meant mastering the art of invisibility. My older brother Jake was the golden boy, 6 feet 2 inches of charm and charisma wrapped up in a letterman jacket, and a smile that could convince anyone of anything. He played quarterback in high school, dated the homecoming queen, and had our parents convinced he was destined for greatness long before he proved them spectacularly wrong. My younger sister Emma was the baby, the artistic dreamer who could do no wrong in our mother's eyes, whose every crayon scribble was treated like a masterpiece worthy of the refrigerator gallery. Then there was me, sandwiched between these two shining stars, noteworthy only for my straight-A report cards that somehow never seemed to generate the same excitement as Jake's touchdown passes or Emma's finger paintings. I learned early that academic achievement was expected, not celebrated, and that my value to the family lay not in who I was, but in how useful I could be to everyone else. The Morrison family dynamics were established long before I was old enough to understand them. Dad, Richard Morrison, ran a moderately successful construction company that kept us comfortable in our split-level house on Maple Street. Mom, Patricia Morrison, worked part-time at the local elementary school and spent the rest of her energy managing what she called family harmony, which really meant making sure Jake got everything he wanted and the rest of us didn't complain too loudly about it. Our extended family gatherings were legendary in our small Oregon town of Millbrook. Every summer for as long as I could remember, the Morrison clan would descend upon the old family property 20 miles outside of town for a weekend of barbecues, games, and what everyone called maintaining family traditions. The property itself was beautiful, 47 acres of rolling hills, old-growth pine trees, and a meandering creek that had been in our family for 3 generations. Great-grandfather Morrison had purchased the land in 1952 with money he'd saved from working in the lumber mills. He'd built a modest cabin that over the years had been expanded into a comfortable retreat with enough bedrooms to sleep 12 people and a wraparound porch that faced the mountains. The property also included a large barn, a fire pit area where we held our evening gatherings, and enough open space for the elaborate games of capture the flag that had become a family tradition. Every year, the same cast of characters would arrive with their tents, RVs, and childhood memories, ready to relive the magic of summers past. Uncle Tom and Aunt Linda would drive up from California with their 3 boys, all of whom worshipped Jake like he was some kind of folk hero. Cousin Michelle would fly in from Denver with stories of her latest business ventures, most of which seemed to exist more in her imagination than in reality. Great Aunt Helen, now in her 80s, would hold court from her lawn chair, dispensing family wisdom and criticizing everyone's life choices with equal enthusiasm. The reunions followed the same pattern every year. Friday evening was for arrivals and catching up. Saturday was for the big barbecue and games. Sunday morning was for the family meeting, where important decisions were made about property maintenance, upcoming expenses, and the general state of Morrison family affairs. It was a tradition that had worked for decades, binding us together, in ways that transcended the geographical distances that separated us for the other 51 weeks of the year. What I didn't realize until much later was that these family meetings had been evolving over time, becoming less about collective decision-making and more about Jake positioning himself as the unofficial head of the family. Dad was getting older, and while he was still sharp and capable, there was an unspoken understanding that leadership would eventually pass to the next generation. Jake had been campaigning for that role since he turned 25, using his natural charisma and everyone's fond memories of his high school glory days to build support for his vision of the family's future. My role in these gatherings had always been clearly defined. I was the responsible one, the one who handled the logistics, managed the budget for shared expenses, and kept track of all the details that everyone else was too busy or too important to worry about. When the septic system needed repair, they called me to coordinate with contractors. When someone needed to file the property tax paperwork, it landed on my desk. When relatives needed directions to the property or help booking flights, somehow my phone was always the one that rang. I told myself I didn't mind. Family was family, and everyone had their role to play. Jake was the leader, Emma was the creative spirit, and I was the problem solver. It seemed like a fair division of labor, even if the recognition wasn't always evenly distributed. Besides, I loved the property as much as anyone else in the family. Those summer weekends were often the highlight of my year. The one time when the scattered Morrison clan came together and remembered why we had chosen to stay connected despite all our differences. The first sign that something was changing came at the reunion 3 years ago, when Jake announced during the Sunday family meeting that he and his wife Rebecca were thinking about moving back to Oregon. They'd been living in Phoenix, where Jake worked in sales for a medical equipment company and Rebecca taught middle school science. They had 2 young children, 7-year-old Connor and 5-year-old Lily, and they were talking about wanting to raise them closer to family. Everyone was excited about the prospect of having Jake back in Oregon. Dad practically glowed with pride as he talked about how wonderful it would be to have his grandchildren nearby. Mom immediately started planning how she could help with childcare and which schools would be best for the kids. Even I was genuinely happy about the idea. Connor and Lily were delightful children, and I had always regretted that geography kept me from being more involved in their lives. But then Jake made a suggestion that caught everyone off guard. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, with that casual confidence that had always been his trademark. "Rebecca and I have been thinking that maybe it's time to put the family property to better use. This place just sits empty most of the year, and the maintenance costs keep going up. What if we moved here permanently? We could fix up the cabin, maybe add on a few rooms, and really make this place the heart of the Morrison family again." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval from most of the adults present. Uncle Tom thought it was a brilliant idea. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Aunt Linda started talking about how much more convenient it would be to have someone living on the property year-round to handle maintenance issues. Even Great Aunt Helen nodded approvingly from her lawn chair, declaring that it was about time. Someone brought some young energy back to the old place. I had reservations, but I kept them to myself. The property held so many memories for all of us, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it being transformed from a shared family retreat into Jake and Rebecca's permanent residence. But I also understood the practical arguments. The cabin did need work, and having someone there to maintain it would certainly solve a lot of problems. If Jake was serious about moving back to Oregon and wanted to take on that responsibility, maybe it was a good solution for everyone. Over the following months, Jake's plan began to take shape. He and Rebecca visited Oregon several times to look at job opportunities and scope out the renovations they wanted to make to the cabin. Jake found a position with a Portland-based company that would allow him to work remotely most of the time. And Rebecca discovered that the local school district was hiring science teachers. Everything seemed to be falling into place for their big move. The next summer's reunion was practically a celebration of Jake's homecoming. He had already given notice at his job in Phoenix. Rebecca had accepted the teaching position, and they were planning to move to Oregon in the fall. The family meeting that year focused almost entirely on the renovations Jake wanted to make to the cabin. He had drawn up elaborate plans for additions that would expand the living space, modernize the kitchen, and add a master suite that would give him and Rebecca the privacy they needed as permanent residents. The cost estimates were substantial. Even with Jake contributing his labor and coordinating much of the work himself, the family was looking at an investment of nearly $60,000. It was more money than had ever been spent on the property at one time, but Jake argued persuasively that the improvements would benefit everyone. The expanded cabin would be more comfortable for future reunions, the updated systems would be more reliable, and having permanent residents would actually save money on property management costs. I found myself assigned to coordinate the financial aspects of the renovation project. As the family's unofficial accountant, I was tasked with getting detailed bids from contractors, setting up a budget, and figuring out how to fairly distribute the costs among all the family members who would benefit from the improvements. It was a complicated project, made more challenging by the fact that not everyone in the family was in the same financial position. Dad and Mom were comfortable but nearing retirement and needed to be careful about large expenses. Uncle Tom and Aunt Linda were dealing with college tuition for their oldest son. Cousin Michelle was between jobs again and couldn't contribute much beyond moral support. The burden of funding Jake's renovation project was going to fall disproportionately on the family members with the most resources, which essentially meant me and a few of the more financially successful cousins. I didn't mind contributing to the project. The property meant a lot to me, and I could afford to help make the improvements that would benefit everyone. But as I dug deeper into the financial planning, I started to uncover some troubling information about the property's legal status. My accounting background had taught me to always verify ownership and legal standing before making major financial commitments, so I decided to pull the official property records from the county courthouse. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about our family property and my place within the Morrison family structure. The property deed told a story that was very different from the family narrative I had grown up believing. According to the official records, great-grandfather Morrison had indeed purchased the 47 acres in 1952, but his will had divided ownership among his children in a way that no one had ever explained to my generation. My grandfather, Robert Morrison, had inherited a 1/3 share of the property. His brother had inherited another third, and their sister had received the final third. Over the years, through deaths, marriages, and a series of legal transactions that I had to trace through decades of courthouse records, the ownership had been redistributed in ways that were far more complex than anyone in my immediate family seemed to understand. My grandfather's third had been passed down to my father, but the other portions had been sold, inherited, and subdivided among various relatives in ways that left the current ownership structure unclear. But the most shocking discovery came when I found a document dated 15 years ago, shortly after my grandfather's death. It was a quitclaim deed that transferred my father's share of the property to a trust, with 3 named beneficiaries: Jake, Emma, and me. Each of us was entitled to an equal share of Dad's portion of the property, which appeared to represent about 40% of the total acreage. I stared at that document for a long time, trying to understand why no one had ever mentioned it to me. According to the legal paperwork, I had been a partial owner of the family property since I was 16 years old. Every decision that had been made about the land, every expense that had been incurred, every plan that had been developed should have involved me as an equal stakeholder with Jake and Emma. But it was clear that Jake knew about the ownership structure because I found his signature on several subsequent documents related to property management and tax payments. Emma had signed some papers too, though based on her characteristic scrawled signature, I suspected she had signed without reading or understanding what she was agreeing to. My signature, however, was nowhere to be found on any of the documents. From the past 15 years, The implications were staggering. Every family meeting where decisions had been made about the property, I had been treated as a helpful volunteer rather than an equal owner. Every expense that had been allocated among family members, my share had been calculated based on my willingness to contribute rather than my legal obligation as an owner. Every plan that had been made for the property's future, I had been consulted, for my expertise rather than my consent as a stakeholder. Most disturbing of all, Jake's renovation project and his plan to live on the property permanently had been developed and approved without any acknowledgement of my ownership rights. He had been making decisions about improvements to property that I legally owned, assuming financial commitments that would affect my investment, and planning to occupy land that belonged to me as much as it belonged to him. I spent the next several weeks digging deeper into the property records, trying to understand the full scope of what had been hidden from me. What I discovered was a pattern of financial management that bordered on fraud. Jake had been collecting rent from a neighbor who grazed cattle on a portion of the property, money that should have been divided among the 3 legal owners. He had signed agreements with utility companies for easements across the land, decisions that should have required consent from all stakeholders. He had even taken out a small loan using the property as collateral, putting my ownership interest at risk without my knowledge or permission. The more I learned, the angrier I became. This wasn't just a case of family miscommunication or oversight. Jake had been deliberately excluding me from decisions about property that I legally owned, treating my share as his own personal asset while expecting me to contribute financially to improvements that would primarily benefit him. He had been stealing from me, plain and simple, using the family's trust and my own ignorance of the legal situation to enrich himself at my expense. But I also realized that I was in a position of considerable power that nobody in my family understood. As an equal owner of the property, I had legal rights that could not be ignored or overruled by majority vote in a family meeting. Any major decisions about the property's use, including Jake's plan to live there permanently, required my consent. Any financial commitments that affected the property's value or created obligations for the owners needed my signature to be legally binding. Jake's entire plan to move to Oregon and renovate the cabin was built on a foundation of assumptions that were legally invalid. He couldn't make those improvements without my agreement. He couldn't live on the property permanently without my consent. He couldn't continue to manage the property's finances without my involvement. And most importantly, he couldn't continue to exclude me from decisions while expecting me to contribute money to projects that I hadn't approved. I had discovered that I wasn't just Sarah Morrison, the helpful family accountant who could be counted on to handle logistics and write checks when needed. I was Sarah Morrison, legal owner of valuable real estate that had been generating income and building equity for years without my knowledge. I was a stakeholder whose rights had been systematically violated by the very people who claimed to love and value me as family. The question was what to do with this information. I could confront Jake privately and demand that he acknowledge my ownership rights and include me in future decisions about the property. I could bring the information to the entire family and let them sort out the implications. Or I could wait for the right moment to reveal what I had learned, choosing my timing to maximize the impact and ensure that my rights would be respected going forward. As I thought about my options, I kept coming back to the upcoming family reunion. Jake would be there with his renovation plans, expecting enthusiastic support and financial commitments from everyone. He would probably give another presentation about his vision for the property's future, assuming that his natural leadership and persuasive abilities would carry the day as they always had. The family would listen to his proposals and look to me to handle the financial details, just as they had done for years. But this time would be different. This time, I would be armed with the truth about who really owned the land beneath our feet. This time, when Jake tried to exclude me from decisions about my own property, I would have the legal documentation to prove that his authority was built on a lie. This time, the helpful family accountant would reveal herself to be something much more powerful, a property owner who had been cheated and was ready to demand justice. I spent the weeks leading up to the reunion carefully preparing my strategy. I made copies of all the relevant documents, highlighting the sections that proved my ownership, and documented Jake's unauthorized actions. I researched my legal rights as a property owner and confirmed that everything I suspected about the invalidity of Jake's decisions was correct. I even consulted with a real estate attorney to make sure I understood all the implications of what I had discovered. But mostly, I thought about how it would feel to finally stand up to the family dynamics that had kept me in a subordinate role for so long. For 31 years, I had been the responsible one, the helpful one, the one who could be counted on to handle the boring details, while the more charismatic family members made the important decisions. I had accepted that role because I loved my family and wanted to contribute to our shared traditions. What I hadn't realized was that my willingness to be helpful had been exploited by people who saw my skills as resources to be used rather than contributions to be valued. Jake hadn't been treating me as a beloved sister whose expertise made the family stronger. He had been treating me as a convenient employee whose services could be taken for granted as long as he maintained the fiction that I was important to the family's success. That fiction was about to be shattered. At the SA. Next family reunion, when Jake stood up to present his plans for the property's future, I would be ready with information that would change everything. I would reveal that the helpful family accountant was actually a property owner whose rights had been systematically violated. I would prove that Jake's leadership was built on deception and theft. And I would make it clear that any plans for the property's future would require my consent as an equal stakeholder. The Morrison family reunion was about to become very interesting indeed. As the reunion weekend approached, I found myself both excited and nervous about what was going to unfold. Part of me felt guilty about keeping my discovery secret, but I had learned from years of family dynamics that information was power, and Jake had been hoarding that power for far too long. He had made his choices about how to treat me and my property rights. Now it was time for him to face the consequences of those choices. I packed my usual supplies for the reunion, but this time I also packed the folder containing all the property, documents, and legal research that would support my case. I practiced what I was going to say, how I was going to present the information, and how I was going to respond to the various reactions I expected from family members. I was ready for Jake's anger, Mom's attempts to smooth things over, and Dad's confusion about how the situation had gotten so complicated. What I wasn't entirely prepared for was how it would feel to finally step out of the role I had played for so long and assert myself as an equal member of the Morrison family, rather than just a useful support person. For the first time in my life, I was going to demand the respect and recognition that I had earned through years of contribution and commitment to our family traditions. The ride to the property felt different this time. Instead of thinking about all the logistics I needed to coordinate and the ways I could help make the weekend successful for everyone else, I was focused on my own objectives and my own rights. I was no longer just attending the Morrison family reunion as the helpful daughter and sister who could be counted on to handle whatever needed handling. I was attending as a property owner who had been excluded from decisions about her own land, and who was finally ready to set the record straight. The moment I pulled into the familiar gravel driveway of the Morrison family property, I could feel the familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with something entirely new, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with helping everyone else have a good time. The late afternoon sun was filtering through the tall pines, casting those long shadows that had been part of every reunion memory I'd ever formed. But this time, instead of immediately thinking about which relatives would need help setting up their tents or what supplies I'd forgotten to coordinate, I was thinking about the folder of legal documents sitting in my passenger seat. Cars were already scattered around the property in the haphazard way that had become tradition. Uncle Tom's RV was parked in its usual spot near the creek, and I could see Aunt Linda hanging colorful bunting between two trees. Cousin Michelle's rental car was pulled up close to the cabin, probably so she could make her dramatic entrance with minimal effort. The sounds of children laughing and adults calling out greetings drifted through my open windows, and for a moment, I felt that familiar tug of nostalgia that these gatherings always brought. Then I remembered why I was really here, and the sentiment hardened into resolve. Jake's truck was prominently positioned near the cabin's front steps, which didn't surprise me. He had always been the type to claim the best parking spot, just as he claimed the best everything else. What did surprise me was seeing a small construction trailer hitched behind his truck, loaded with what looked like building supplies and renovation equipment. Apparently, he was so confident about moving forward with his cabin improvements that he'd already started purchasing materials. The sight of those supplies sent a fresh wave of anger through me. Jake was literally bringing construction materials onto property that I co-owned, planning renovations that I hadn't approved, expecting financial contributions that I hadn't agreed to make. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also perfectly consistent with how he'd been treating me and my ownership rights for years. I parked my Honda at the far edge of the property, deliberately choosing a spot that would give me a clear view of the entire gathering area, while keeping me slightly removed from the initial chaos of arrivals. I needed to observe the dynamics and get a sense of how things were developing before I made my move. The folder of documents stayed locked in my car for now, but I made sure my car keys were easily accessible. If this confrontation went badly, I wanted to be able to leave quickly. "Sarah," Mom's voice carried across the property as she spotted me getting out of my car. She was wearing her usual reunion outfit, khaki pants, a floral blouse, and the kind of comfortable walking shoes that suggested she was ready for a weekend of maternal multitasking. Her smile was genuine, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt about what I was planning to do. She had no idea that her son had been systematically stealing from her daughter, and the revelation was going to shatter her idealized vision of our family harmony. But then I reminded myself that Mom's ignorance didn't excuse Jake's behavior, and her tendency to smooth over conflicts had probably enabled his sense of entitlement for years. If she was shocked to learn what Jake had been doing, maybe that shock would finally motivate her to hold him accountable for his actions. "Hi, Mom," I said, accepting her enthusiastic hug while mentally preparing myself for the weekend ahead. "How's everything going so far?" "Oh, you know how it is," she said, already pulling me toward the main gathering area where most of the family had congregated. Jake and Rebecca got here early to start setting up for tomorrow's presentation about the cabin renovations. They're so excited about the project, and Jake has put together the most detailed plans. Wait until you see what he's envisioned for this place. I bet he has, I thought grimly. Nothing like making detailed plans for property you don't actually have the right to renovate. As we walked toward the group, I could see Jake holding court near the fire pit, surrounded by several relatives who were listening intently to whatever he was saying. He was gesturing animatedly, probably describing his renovation plans, and I could see the familiar charismatic energy that had always made him the center of attention at family gatherings. Rebecca was sitting beside him, occasionally adding details or clarifications, playing the role of supportive wife to perfection. Connor and Lily were running around with some of the other children, their laughter mixing with the general buzz of conversation and the crackling of the fire that someone had already started despite the warm weather. It struck me that those innocent children were going to be affected by whatever happened this weekend, and I felt another pang of guilt about the confrontation I was planning. But then I remembered that Connor and Lily's future was being built on a foundation of deception and theft. If Jake was willing to steal from his own sister to fund his family's lifestyle, what other corners was he cutting? What other ethical boundaries was he willing to cross when it served his purposes? Maybe exposing his behavior now would actually protect those children from learning that dishonesty was an acceptable way to get what you wanted. "There's our financial wizard," Jake called out as he spotted me approaching the group. His smile was warm and welcoming, the same expression he'd worn while systematically excluding me from decisions about my own property. "Perfect timing, Sarah. I was just telling everyone about the contractor bids I've been collecting for the cabin project. The group turned to look at me expectantly, and I could see the familiar dynamic already taking shape. Jake would present his grand vision. Everyone would get excited about the possibilities, and then they would all look to me to figure out how to make it financially feasible. I was the practical one, the detail-oriented one, the one who could transform dreams into spreadsheets and budgets into reality. Except this time, I had information that was going to change the entire conversation. Actually, I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral, I think we should wait until tomorrow's family meeting to discuss the renovation project. I have some questions about the property that I'd like to address before we talk about making any major changes. Jake's expression flickered slightly, just for a moment, but I caught it. There was something in his eyes that looked almost like wariness, as if some part of him suspected that I might know more than I was letting on. But then his politician's smile was back in place, and he was nodding agreeably. Of course, he said smoothly. Tomorrow's meeting will be the perfect time to go over all the details. I've prepared a comprehensive presentation that covers everything, from timeline to budget to long-term value projections. I wondered if his comprehensive presentation included any mention of the fact that he didn't have the legal authority to authorize the renovations he was proposing. Somehow, I doubted it. The rest of Friday evening passed in the familiar rhythm of reunion activities. We shared a potluck dinner featuring everyone's traditional contributions: Aunt Linda's famous potato salad, Uncle Tom's barbecued ribs, Great Aunt Tai, Helen's green bean casserole that no one really liked but everyone pretended to enjoy. I found myself going through the motions of family interaction, while part of my mind remained focused on the confrontation that was coming. Several relatives made comments about how excited they were to hear Jake's renovation plans, and I responded, with non-committal murmurs that could be interpreted as enthusiasm or skepticism, depending on what the listener wanted to hear. I wasn't ready to tip my hand yet, but I also wasn't going to pretend to support a project that I hadn't approved and that Jake had no right to pursue without my consent. As the evening wound down and people began retreating to their tents and RVs, Jake approached me near the dying fire pit. We were essentially alone, with just the sounds of distant conversations and the rustle of people getting settled for the night. "I'm really glad you're here, Sarah," he said, settling into the chair beside mine. "I know this renovation project is going to require a significant financial commitment from everyone, but I think you'll agree that it's the right investment for the family's future." The presumption in his tone was exactly what I'd expected, but hearing it still made my blood pressure spike. He was talking to me like I was a potential investor he needed to convince, not a co-owner whose consent he was legally required to obtain. "Tell me something, Jake," I said, deciding to test the waters a little. "When you've been making decisions about the property over the years, have you ever thought about including Emma and me in the process?" He looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "What do you mean? You've always been involved. You handle all the financial coordination. You organize the maintenance schedules. You're the one who keeps track of all the details that the rest of us don't have time for." "I mean involved in the decision-making," I clarified. "Not just handling the logistics after the decisions have already been made." Jake's expression shifted slightly, and I could see him calculating how to respond. "Well, you know how it is. With family stuff, someone has to take the lead, and Dad's getting older, so naturally the responsibility falls to me as the oldest son. But your input is always valuable, and I definitely want to hear your thoughts about the renovation project." The casual dismissal of my rights and Emma's rights was so complete that I almost wondered if Jake genuinely didn't understand what he'd been doing. But then I remembered all the documents he'd signed, all the decisions he'd made, all the money he'd collected from the property without sharing it with Emma and me. There was no way his exclusion of us was accidental. "What about Emma?" I asked. "Shouldn't she be involved in decisions about the family property too?" Jake actually laughed at that question. "Come on, Sarah. You know Emma. She's got her head in the clouds half the time. worried about her art projects and her yoga classes. She doesn't have the practical skills to handle property management decisions. She's perfectly happy to let us take care of the business side of things as long as she can still come to the reunions and enjoy the property. The condescension in his voice was staggering. He was talking about our sister like she was a child who couldn't be trusted with important decisions, when in reality she was a 30-year-old woman with her own career and her own life. But more importantly, he was talking about her like her legal ownership of the property was irrelevant because he'd decided she wasn't qualified to exercise her rights. "I see," I said carefully. "So you think Emma and I are happy to let you make all the important decisions about the property because we're not capable of handling the responsibility ourselves." "That's not what I said," Jake protested, but his tone suggested that it was exactly what he meant. "I just think it makes sense to play to everyone's strengths. You're great with numbers and logistics, Emma's great with creative stuff, and I'm good at big-picture planning and leadership. We all contribute in our own ways." Except his version of contribution seemed to involve him making all the decisions and collecting all the benefits while Emma and I provided labor and financial support without any real say in how our own property was managed. It was a perfect encapsulation of the family dynamics that had shaped our entire lives. "Well," I said, standing up and stretching as if I was just getting ready for bed, "I guess we'll have plenty to discuss at tomorrow's meeting." Jake nodded confidently. "I think you're going to be really impressed with what Rebecca and I have planned. This renovation is going to transform the property into something really special." As I walked back to my tent, I couldn't help but think about how wrong he was. Tomorrow's meeting was definitely going to transform something, but it wasn't going to be the property. It was going to be Jake's understanding of his place in the Morrison family hierarchy. Saturday dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for the traditional reunion activities that would lead up to Sunday morning's family meeting. I woke up early, partly from excitement and partly from anxiety about what was coming. The property looked beautiful in the morning light, with mist rising from the creek and the sound of birds echoing through the pine trees. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to have a normal family gathering, one where I could simply enjoy the natural beauty and the pleasure of being with relatives I saw only once a year. But that fantasy was quickly replaced by the reality of what I needed to do. I retrieved the folder of documents from my car and spent a few minutes reviewing them one more time, making sure I had all the facts straight and all the evidence organized. I wanted to be absolutely certain of my ground when the confrontation finally came. The morning passed in the usual flurry of reunion activities. There was a touch football game that Jake organized and dominated, demonstrating the athletic prowess that had made him the family favorite decades earlier. There were nature walks for the older relatives and treasure hunts for the children. Aunt Linda organized a cooking competition that somehow turned into a good-natured argument about whose chili recipe was superior. Through it all, I found myself watching the family dynamics with new eyes, seeing patterns that I'd never noticed before. Jake was indeed the natural leader, the one who organized activities and made decisions that everyone else went along with. But I also noticed how often his leadership involved assigning tasks to other people while positioning himself as the coordinator who deserved credit for the success of whatever was being accomplished. More troubling was the way other family members deferred to him on questions that should have been group decisions. When someone suggested changing the location of the afternoon barbecue, everyone looked to Jake for approval. When Uncle Tom wanted to know if it was okay to move some firewood from one location to another, he asked Jake's permission. Even Dad, who technically owned the property along with Emma and me, seemed to automatically defer to Jake's authority on matters related to the land. It was a pattern that had probably been developing for years, so gradually that no one had really noticed how completely Jake had positioned himself as the unofficial head of the Morrison family. Everyone had just accepted that his natural leadership abilities made him the logical person to make decisions about shared family resources. The fact that he didn't actually have the legal authority to make those decisions had somehow never come up in conversation. Rebecca seemed to understand her role in this dynamic perfectly. She supported Jake's leadership without being pushy about it, and she had clearly mastered the art of making suggestions that sounded like helpful ideas rather than attempts to influence family policy. I watched her deflect questions about the renovation project by saying that Jake had all the details and would share everything at the family meeting. She was positioning herself as the supportive wife who was excited about her husband's plans without overstepping her bounds as an in-law. The more I observed, the more I realized that tomorrow's revelation was going to be even more shocking than I'd anticipated. The entire family had organized itself around the assumption that Jake was the legitimate authority figure when it came to property decisions. Learning that his authority was built on deception and legal violations was going to shake the foundation of relationships that had been years in the making. As the day progressed, several relatives made comments to me about how generous I was being with the renovation project, praising my willingness to contribute financially to improvements that would benefit everyone. Each comment was like a small slap, reminding me that the family saw my contributions as voluntary generosity rather than the obligations of a property owner who should have been consulted about the decisions being made with her money. Cousin Michelle actually pulled me aside during the afternoon barbecue to thank me for being so supportive of Jake's vision for the property. "I know these big projects can be stressful to coordinate," she said, apparently forgetting that she had been notably absent from any actual coordination efforts over the years. "But I think it's wonderful that you're using your financial skills to help Jake make his dreams come true. This renovation is going to be such a gift to the whole family." The irony was almost too much to bear. The family thought I was being generous by contributing to renovations on my own property, while Jake was being praised for his vision and leadership in planning improvements that he had no legal right to authorize. Meanwhile, Emma wasn't even part of the conversation, despite being an equal owner with Jake and me. That evening, as the family gathered around the fire pit for the traditional Saturday night storytelling and reminiscing, Jake stood up to address the group. "I want to thank everyone for being here this weekend," he began, his voice carrying the warm confidence that had always made him a natural public speaker. "These reunions mean so much to Rebecca and me, and we're especially excited about tomorrow's family meeting because we'll be sharing our vision for the property's future." There were murmurs of anticipation from the assembled relatives, and I could see the genuine affection and trust in their faces as they looked at Jake. They believed in him, trusted his judgment, and were excited to support whatever he had planned. The knowledge that I was about to shatter that trust made me feel slightly sick, but it also strengthened my resolve. "I know some of these decisions involve significant financial commitments," Jake continued, his eyes briefly meeting mine across the fire. "But I believe that investing in this property is really investing in our family's future. We're not just talking about home improvements. We're talking about creating a legacy that our children and grandchildren will treasure for generations to come." The speech was perfectly calibrated to appeal to the family's sentimental attachment to the property and their desire to preserve Morrison traditions for future generations. Jake had always been skilled at framing his personal desires as benefits for the entire family, and this was no exception. He was presenting his plan to live on the property permanently as a selfless act of stewardship rather than what it really was, an attempt to gain control of valuable real estate that he didn't legally own. After Jake's speech, the conversation naturally turned to excited speculation about what his renovation plans might include. Great Aunt Helen suggested that it was about time someone brought the cabin into the 21st century. Uncle Tom wondered if the improvements would include better facilities for the reunions. Dad actually got a little emotional talking about how proud he was of Jake for taking on the responsibility of caring for the family land. Throughout this conversation, I noticed that no one asked Emma what she thought about Jake's plans, and no one seemed to consider that there might be other perspectives worth hearing. Emma herself seemed content to listen to the discussion without participating, occasionally nodding or smiling, but not contributing her own opinions. I wondered if years of being excluded from these discussions had trained her to see herself as a spectator rather than a stakeholder. As the evening wound down and people began drifting off to their sleeping arrangements, I made my final preparations for tomorrow's confrontation. I organized the documents in my folder one more time, making sure that the most important evidence was easily accessible. I mentally rehearsed the key points I wanted to make and the order in which I wanted to present the information. Most importantly, I tried to prepare myself emotionally for what was going to be a very difficult conversation. Jake's reaction was going to be explosive, and I knew that other family members were going to be confused, hurt, and possibly angry. Some of them might even blame me for disrupting the family harmony by raising legal issues that they would prefer to ignore. But I also reminded myself that I wasn't the one who had created this situation. Jake was the one who had chosen to exclude Emma and me from decisions about our own property. Jake was the one who had been collecting income from the land without sharing it with his co-owners. Jake was the one who had been making financial commitments that put our shared investment at risk without getting our consent. I was simply going to tell the truth about what had been happening and insist on my rights as a property owner. If that disrupted the family's comfortable illusions about Jake's leadership and authority, then maybe those illusions needed to be disrupted. Sunday morning arrived with an overcast sky that seemed appropriate for the storm that was about to break over the Morrison family gathering. The traditional family meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, after breakfast, but before, people started packing up to leave. It was the time slot that had always been reserved for the most important family business, and everyone understood that attendance was expected rather than optional. I was up early, drinking coffee and watching the property come to life as relatives emerged from tents and RVs to begin their morning routines. Jake was already busy setting up a presentation area near the cabin, arranging chairs in a semicircle facing a table where he had laid out architectural drawings, cost estimates, and what looked like a detailed timeline for his renovation project. The sight of those materials confirmed what I had suspected. Jake had invested significant time and effort into developing his renovation plans, probably assuming that family approval was just a formality. He had architectural drawings that must have cost hundreds of dollars to prepare. He had detailed cost estimates that suggested he'd already gotten multiple bids from contractors. He even had a timeline that included specific dates for different phases of the construction process. All of this preparation was impressive, but it was also further evidence of how completely Jake had excluded Emma and me from the planning process. These weren't preliminary ideas that he was bringing to the family for input and discussion. These were finished plans that he expected the family to approve and fund. He had made decisions about renovations to property that we legally owned without even consulting us about whether we wanted the improvements he was proposing. Rebecca was helping him arrange the presentation materials, and I could see her nervous energy as she fussed with the placement of chairs and the organization of documents. She knew how much this project meant to Jake, and she was probably worried about whether the family would be as enthusiastic about the financial commitment as they were about the general concept of improvements. What she didn't know was that the financial commitment was the least of their problems. As 10 o'clock approached, the family began gathering in the presentation area Jake had set up. Great Aunt Helen claimed her usual position in the most comfortable chair, while Uncle Tom and Aunt Linda settled in with notebooks and pens, ready to take notes on whatever Jake was going to propose. Dad and Mom sat in the front row, their faces glowing with parental pride as they prepared to hear their son's vision for the family property. Emma arrived just as the meeting was starting, looking slightly frazzled but cheerful in her usual, artistic way. She was wearing a flowing skirt and a hand-painted t-shirt that probably represented her latest creative project, and her long hair was pulled back in a messy bun that somehow looked both casual and elegant. She settled into a chair near the back of the group, apparently content to listen to whatever was going to be discussed without expecting to play a major role in the decision-making process. I chose a seat that was strategically positioned to give me a clear view of Jake's presentation area while also allowing me to see the reactions of other family members. The folder containing my documentation was on my lap, but I kept it closed for now. I wanted to let Jake complete his presentation before I revealed what I had discovered about the property's legal status. Jake stood at the front of the group, looking confident and prepared as he surveyed the assembled family members. He was wearing khaki pants and a button-down shirt that gave him a professional appearance, and his presentation materials were organized on the table beside him like a real estate agent's sales pitch. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying easily across the small gathering. "As most of you know, Rebecca and I have been developing plans to move back to Oregon and make some significant improvements to the family cabin. Today, I want to share the details of what we're proposing and get your input on how to move forward." He turned to the architectural drawings spread out on the table behind him. These plans represent months of work with architects and contractors to develop a renovation that will modernize the cabin while preserving its historic character. We're talking about expanding the living space by about 800 square feet, updating all the electrical and plumbing systems, and adding amenities that will make the property more comfortable for everyone. The drawings were indeed impressive, showing a transformed cabin with additional bedrooms, an expanded kitchen, and a covered porch that would provide more outdoor living space. Jake walked the family through each element of the design, explaining how the improvements would benefit both his family as permanent residents and the extended family during reunion weekends. The total cost for all these improvements is estimated at $68,000, Jake continued, presenting a detailed budget breakdown that showed expenses for materials, labor, permits, and contingencies. Rebecca and I are prepared to contribute our labor for much of the work and will coordinate all the contractors and suppliers. What we need from the family is financial support for the materials and professional services that require specialized expertise. He presented a funding plan that divided the costs among family members based on their perceived ability to contribute, with the largest shares assigned to me and two of our more financially successful cousins. The plan assumed that everyone would be willing to make the contributions he had calculated, and that the improvements would be completed over the following 18 months. "I know this represents a significant investment," Jake said, his tone becoming more serious as he addressed the financial implications. "But I believe these improvements will add substantial value to the property while creating a family retreat that our children and grandchildren will treasure for decades to come." The presentation was masterful, combining practical details with emotional appeals in a way that made Jake's vision seem both sensible and inspiring. Several family members were nodding approvingly, and I could see Uncle Tom making calculations in his notebook as he considered how much his family might be able to contribute to the project. "Are there any questions about the renovation plans?" Jake asked, looking around the group with the confident expression of someone who expected only minor clarifications and enthusiastic approval. Great Aunt Helen raised her hand. "Will these improvements interfere with our ability to use the property for reunions?" "Not at all," Jake replied smoothly. "In fact, the additional space and updated facilities will make the reunions more comfortable for everyone. We're specifically designing the improvements to enhance the property's ability to accommodate large family gatherings." Uncle Tom had a question about the timeline. Cousin Michelle wanted to know about the impact on property taxes. Dad asked about the contractors Jake was planning to use and seemed satisfied with the response about hiring local businesses with good reputations. Each question was answered confidently and thoroughly, demonstrating that Jake had indeed done his homework. On the practical aspects of the renovation project, if I hadn't known about the legal issues surrounding his authority to make these decisions, I might have been impressed by the thoroughness of his preparation. "Any other questions?" Jake asked, scanning the group with growing confidence as it became apparent that the family's initial reaction was positive. This was my moment. I raised my hand, and Jake's eyes met mine with an expression that was friendly but slightly wary. "I have several questions," I said, standing up and opening the folder I had been holding in my lap. "But they're not about The renovation plans themselves. They're about your authority to make these decisions in the first place. The temperature of the gathering seemed to drop several degrees as family members registered the serious tone in my voice. Jake's confident expression flickered, and I could see Rebecca's face tighten with concern as she sensed that something was about to go very wrong with their carefully planned presentation. "I'm not sure what you mean," Jake said carefully, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew exactly what I meant. I pulled the first document from my folder, a copy of the property deed that showed the current ownership structure. "I mean that according to the legal records, you don't have the authority to authorize $68,000 in renovations to this property without the consent of your co-owners." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the sound of birds calling from the trees around us. Every family member was staring at me with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm, and Jake's face had gone pale beneath his summer tan. "Co-owners?" Dad asked, his voice uncertain. "What are you talking about, Sarah?" I held up the deed document so that everyone could see it. "I'm talking about the fact that this property isn't owned by Dad alone, as everyone seems to believe. According to the legal records, ownership was transferred to a trust 15 years ago, with 3 equal beneficiaries: Jake, Emma, and me." Emma's mouth fell open in shock. "What?" "That's right, Emma," I said, turning to look at my sister directly. "You own 1/3 of this property. You have since you were 18 years old. And you, Jake," I continued, focusing on my brother's stunned face, "have been making decisions about our property for years without consulting us or even telling us that we had ownership rights." The gathering erupted in confused murmurs as family members tried to process what I was saying. Uncle Tom was asking Dad if this was true. Great Aunt Helen was demanding to see the documents I was holding. Mom was looking back and forth between Jake and me with an expression of complete bewilderment. But Jake himself said nothing. He just stood there, his presentation materials suddenly seeming insignificant compared to the legal bombshell I had just dropped. "Let me see that deed," Dad said, standing up and walking over to where I was standing. I handed him the document, and he studied it carefully, his face growing more troubled as he read the legal language that established the trust and named the 3 beneficiaries. "This is legitimate," he said finally, his voice heavy with implications. He was just beginning to understand. I remember signing these papers after Dad died. The attorney said it was the best way to handle the inheritance tax issues. "And did anyone ever explain to Emma and me that we were property owners?" I asked. "Did anyone ever mention that we had legal rights that should have been respected when decisions were being made about our land?" The silence stretched out again as family members began to grasp the magnitude of what had been revealed. Emma was staring at the deed document in Dad's hands like it was written in a foreign language. Jake was looking around the group as if searching for some way to explain or defend what had been happening for years. "Jake?" Rebecca said quietly, her voice carrying a note of panic as she realized that their carefully planned future was suddenly in jeopardy. "Is this true?" For the first time since I'd known him, my brother seemed to be at a complete loss for words. Jake's silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but I could see his mind working behind his eyes, searching for some way to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his expectations. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its earlier confidence and carried an edge of desperation that I'd never heard from him before. "Sarah, this is ridiculous," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. "You're making this sound like some kind of conspiracy, when it's just family business. Yes, technically you and Emma might be listed on some paperwork, but that doesn't mean you've been excluded from anything important. You've always been involved in decisions about the property." I pulled out another document from my folder, this one showing the rental agreement Jake had signed with the neighbor who grazed cattle on our land. "Really? Then why don't Emma and I receive our share of the rental income from this grazing lease?" Why don't we get copies of the financial statements you file with the county? Why weren't we consulted about this easement agreement you signed with the utility company? Each document I produced hit Jake like a physical blow, and I could see the color draining from his face as he realized how thoroughly I had researched his unauthorized management of our shared property. Rebecca had moved closer to him, her hand on his arm in a gesture that looked supportive, but was probably meant to keep him from saying something that would make the situation worse. "There's income from the property?" Emma asked, her voice small and confused. "How much income?" I consulted my notes. Over the past 5 years, Jake has collected approximately $12,000 in rental fees from the grazing lease alone. That doesn't include the utility easement payments or the timber harvest revenue from when those dead trees were cleared 3 years ago. Emma's face went through a series of expressions as she processed this information. Confusion, hurt, and finally a growing anger that I'd rarely seen from my generally peaceful sister. "Jake, you've been collecting money from property that I own, and you never told me about it?" "It wasn't like that," Jake protested. But his explanation sounded weak even to him. The amounts were small, and I was using the money for property, maintenance, and improvements. It all went back into the land. I pulled out the bank statements I'd obtained through my research. "Actually, most of it went into your personal checking account. Would you like me to read the deposit records?" The family gathering had become something entirely different from what anyone had expected. What should have been an enthusiastic discussion of renovation plans had turned into a public accounting of years of financial deception. I could see the shock and disappointment on the faces of relatives who had trusted Jake's leadership without question, and the growing realization that their golden boy had been systematically stealing from his own sisters. Dad stepped forward, his face grave as he tried to understand the full scope of what had been revealed. "Jake, is what Sarah is saying true? Have you been managing the property finances without including Emma and Sarah as co-owners?" Jake looked around the assembled family members, probably searching for some source of support or sympathy, but found only confused and disappointed faces staring back at him. Even Uncle Tom, who had always been one of Jake's biggest supporters, was shaking his head in dismay. "I was protecting their interests," Jake said finally, his voice gaining some strength as he settled on a defensive strategy. "Sarah has her own successful business to worry about, and Emma has never shown any interest in property management. I was handling all the details, so they wouldn't have to be bothered with every little decision and expense." "Protecting our interests by stealing our money?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Protecting our interests by making financial commitments that put our investment at risk without our knowledge or consent?" "I never stole anything," Jake shot back, his own anger finally surfacing. "Every penny that came from this property was invested right back into maintaining and improving it. If you want to get technical about ownership percentages, then you should also pay your fair share of the maintenance costs, the property taxes, the insurance premiums, and all the other expenses that I've been covering on my own." It was a clever deflection, trying to make it seem like he had been subsidizing Emma and me rather than the other way around. But I had prepared for this argument too. "Actually," I said, consulting another set of documents, "Emma and I have been paying property taxes through the county's automatic payment system that was set up years ago. We've also been contributing to a property maintenance fund that you established, though apparently you never told us that we were contributing to maintenance on our own land." I handed copies of the payment records to Dad and several other family members. Over the past 5 years, Emma and I have each contributed over $8,000 to property expenses, while Jake has been collecting income from our land and making decisions about our investment without our consent. Emma stood up from her chair, her artistic clothes and gentle demeanor suddenly seeming incongruous with the steel in her voice. "Jake, I trusted you. We all trusted you. I signed papers because you said they were routine maintenance issues, and I contributed money because you said the family property needed support. I never imagined that you were taking advantage of that trust to steal from me." The word steal hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Jake flinched as if Emma had slapped him, and Rebecca's face crumpled as she began to understand the full implications of what her husband had been doing. "We had no idea," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake, you told me that the property management was a family responsibility that your father had asked you to take on. You never said anything about Sarah and Emma being legal owners." Jake turned on his wife with an expression of betrayal, as if her failure to provide unconditional support was somehow worse than his years of deception. "Rebecca, you know how complicated family business can be? I was trying to keep things simple and avoid exactly this kind of conflict. By lying to everyone involved?" Great Aunt Helen's voice cut through the tension like a knife. At 83 years old, she had seen enough family drama to recognize deception when she heard it, and her tone carried the moral authority of someone who had no patience for excuses. "Young man, what you've done is called fraud, and the fact that you did it to your own sisters makes it even more shameful." The word fraud seemed to galvanize Jake's remaining defenses. He straightened up, his politician's instincts kicking in as he tried to regain control of the narrative. "Let's not get carried away with dramatic accusations," he said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when he was trying to de-escalate conflicts. "This is a family matter that can be resolved through family discussion. Sarah has raised some valid points about communication and transparency, and I'm willing to address those concerns moving forward. But I wasn't interested in letting him minimize what he had done or control the conversation any longer." I pulled out the final document from my folder, the one that I had been saving for this moment. "Actually, Jake, this stopped being just a family matter when you took out a loan using our property as collateral without our knowledge or consent," I said, holding up the mortgage documents I had discovered. "You borrowed $15,000 against land that we own, and you did it by forging our signatures on the loan application." The effect of this revelation was immediate and devastating. Dad actually staggered backward as if I had physically struck him. Mom made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Emma's face went completely white, and she sat down heavily in her chair as if her legs would no longer support her. Jake's carefully constructed defenses finally crumbled completely. "Sarah, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" I interrupted, my voice rising with the anger I had been holding back for months. "Explain how you forged our signatures on legal documents? Explain how you put our shared investment at risk to fund your personal expenses? Explain how you've been planning to spend $68,000 on renovations to property that you don't have the legal right to modify without our consent?" I turned to address the entire family gathering, making sure that everyone understood the full scope of what had been happening. For years, Jake has been treating Emma and me like we were generous relatives who could be counted on to contribute money and labor to support his management of family property. What he never told any of us was that we weren't just contributing to someone else's project. We were paying to maintain and improve our own land while he collected the profits and made all the decisions. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Mom crying softly into her hands. Dad was staring at Jake with an expression of profound disappointment that seemed to age him 10 years in the span of a few minutes. "Son," Dad said finally, his voice heavy with grief and disbelief, "how could you do this to your own sisters?" Jake looked around the group one more time, probably hoping to find some source of support or understanding, but found only faces, filled with shock, disappointment, and betrayal. His shoulders sagged as he finally seemed to accept that his carefully constructed version of reality had been permanently shattered. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said, his voice barely audible. "It started as just handling the details that nobody else wanted to worry about, and then it became easier to just keep managing things myself rather than trying to coordinate with everyone else." "And the money?" Emma asked, her voice still, steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Did you ever intend to tell us that we were entitled to our share of the income from our own property?" Jake's response was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, it was so quiet that several family members had to lean forward to hear him. I convinced myself that I was earning it by doing all the work to manage the property. I told myself that you were both busy with your own lives and careers, and that this was my contribution to the family. Your contribution, I repeated, making sure everyone heard the twisted logic he was using to justify his actions. Taking money that legally belonged to your sisters was your contribution to the family. Uncle Tom stood up from his chair, his face grim with the kind of anger that comes from realizing you've been deceived by someone you trusted. Jake, I've known you since you were born, and I've always been proud of the man you seem to be becoming. But what Sarah is describing isn't a misunderstanding or a communication problem. It's theft, plain and simple. And fraud, added Cousin. Michelle, who had been notably quiet during most of the confrontation, but had apparently heard enough to form her own judgment. Forging signatures on loan documents is a felony, Jake. You could go to prison for what you've done. The mention of criminal charges seemed to be the final straw for Rebecca, who had been growing more distraught as each new revelation emerged. She stood up abruptly, her face streaked with tears and her voice shaking with emotion. I can't do this, she said, looking around the group with an expression of pure panic. Connor, Lily, we need to go home, now. She began gathering up the children, who had been playing nearby and were now staring at the adults with confusion and fear. The sight of those innocent children being swept up in the consequences of their father's actions brought home the human cost of Jake's deception in a way that financial documents and legal arguments couldn't. Rebecca, wait, Jake called after his wife, finally seeming to understand that the consequences of his actions were going to extend far beyond family. Embarrassment. We can work this out. Sarah, Emma, we're family. We can find a solution that works for everyone. But Rebecca was already walking away, carrying Lily and calling for Connor to follow her to their car. The sound of car doors slamming and an engine starting emphasized the finality of her departure and the complete collapse of Jake's renovation plans. I watched my brother standing alone in front of his abandoned presentation materials, his architectural drawings and cost estimates now seeming like artifacts from a different world where his authority and leadership had been unquestioned. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. The golden boy who had been the center of family attention for so long was finally experiencing the consequences of taking that attention for granted. But then I remembered the years of being treated like a helpful volunteer rather than a co-owner of valuable property, and my sympathy evaporated. So what happens now? Emma asked, her voice still shaky but gaining strength as she began to process the full implications of what she had learned. What are our options as property owners? It was a question I had been prepared to answer, because I had spent weeks researching exactly what rights Emma and I had as co-owners of property that had been mismanaged by the third owner. We have several options, I said, pulling out one final document from my folder. We can demand a full accounting of all property finances for the past 15 years. We can require that all future decisions about the property be made by majority vote of the three owners. We can demand that Jake repay the money he's taken from the property without authorization. I paused to let those options sink in before presenting the most serious possibility. Or we can petition the court to force a sale of the property and divide the proceeds according to our ownership percentages. The mention of selling the family property sent a shock through the remaining family members. Great Aunt Helen actually gasped, and Dad looked like I had suggested burning down the cabin. Sell the property? Mom asked, her voice horrified. Sarah, this land has been in our family for generations. You can't be serious about selling it. I'm completely serious, I replied, my voice calm but firm. Jake has demonstrated that he can't be trusted to manage our shared investment honestly or legally. If he's willing to forge our signatures and steal our money, what other corners is he cutting? What other laws is he willing to break when it serves his purposes? Jake finally found his voice again, though it was stripped of all its earlier confidence. Sarah, please don't do this to the family. Don't punish everyone else because you're angry with me." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said, turning to look him directly in the eye. "I'm protecting my investment and my legal rights from someone who has proven that he will violate both when he thinks he can get away with it." Emma stood up and walked over to where I was standing, her movement symbolically aligning herself with me for the first time in our adult lives. "Jake, you made this choice when you decided to treat our property like your personal asset. You created this situation, not Sarah." The sight of his two sisters standing together in opposition to him seemed to break something fundamental in Jake's understanding of family dynamics. For his entire life, he had been the center around which the Morrison family had revolved. The possibility that his sisters might have their own agency and their own rights had apparently never occurred to him. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice taking on a pleading quality that I'd never heard from him before. "What do I have to do to fix this?" Emma and I exchanged glances, and I could see that she was waiting for me to take the lead in defining our terms. After years of being the family problem solver, I was finally in a position to solve the biggest problem of all: the assumption that Jake's wants and needs were more important than anyone else's rights. "First," I said, "you're going to provide a complete accounting of all income and expenses related to the property for the past 15 years. Every rental payment, every timber sale, every easement fee, every maintenance expense, every tax payment, everything." Jake nodded reluctantly, apparently understanding that this was not a negotiation. "Second, you're going to repay Emma and me for our share of the income you've collected from our property without authorization. Based on my preliminary calculations, that's approximately $8,000 each, plus interest. Third, you're going to refinance that loan you took out against our property, removing our names from any collateral agreements that we didn't consent to sign." Jake's face was growing paler with each demand, but he continued nodding. "And fourth," Emma said, speaking up for the first time in the negotiation, "any future decisions about the property will be made by all three owners together, with equal votes and equal say in how our investment is managed." "What about the renovation project?" Jake asked, gesturing weakly toward his abandoned presentation materials. "Rebecca and I were counting on being able to live here. We've already given notice on our apartment in Phoenix." I looked at Emma, and she nodded slightly, giving me permission to deliver the final blow to Jake's plans. "The renovation project is canceled," I said simply. "Emma and I don't consent to those improvements, and without our consent, you don't have the authority to proceed." The finality of that statement seemed to drain the last of Jake's fight out of him. He sank into one of the chairs he had arranged for his presentation, his head in his hands, surrounded by the architectural drawings and cost estimates that now represented nothing more than wasted effort and broken dreams. Dad approached Emma and me, his expression grave but respectful in a way that I'd never seen from him before. "Girls, I owe you both an apology. I should have made sure you understood your ownership rights years ago, and I should have been paying closer attention to how Jake was managing the property." "Thank you, Dad," Emma said, her voice still emotional but steadier than it had been. "That means a lot to hear." Great Aunt Helen struggled to her feet, using her cane for support as she made her way over to where Emma and I were standing. "You girls did the right thing," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough family conflicts to recognize justice when it emerged. Sometimes family loyalty means holding people accountable for their actions, not covering up their mistakes. Over the next hour, the family gathering slowly dissolved as relatives processed what they had witnessed and began making their own decisions about how to respond to the revelations about Jake's behavior. Some of them approached Emma and me to express their support and apologize for not questioning Jake's authority sooner. Others seemed uncomfortable with the conflict and made polite excuses about needing to start their drives home. Uncle Tom and Aunt Linda were among the supporters, with Uncle Tom taking me aside to say that he had suspected something wasn't right about the property finances, but had trusted Jake's explanations without investigating further. Cousin Michelle was more blunt, telling Emma and me that she was proud of us for standing up to Jake's manipulation and glad that someone had finally called him out on his behavior. Jake himself remained in his chair for most of this time, staring at his abandoned presentation materials with an expression of complete defeat. Rebecca eventually returned to collect him, her face grim but resigned as she helped him gather up his things. Their children were already in the car, probably still confused about why their father's big presentation had ended with their mother crying and everyone acting angry. As Jake and Rebecca prepared to leave, he made one final attempt to appeal to Emma and me. "I know I made mistakes," he said, his voice sincere but still carrying an undertone of self-pity. "But I hope you'll remember that everything I did was motivated by love for this family and this property. I never intended to hurt anyone." Emma looked at him with an expression that mixed sadness with disappointment. "Jake, the problem isn't your intentions. The problem is that you never thought our opinions and our rights mattered enough to ask for them." I added my own final statement. "You didn't make mistakes, Jake. You made choices. You chose to exclude us from decisions about our own property. You chose to keep money that legally belonged to us. You chose to forge our signatures on legal documents. Those weren't accidents or misunderstandings. They were deliberate actions that you took because you thought you could get away with them." Jake had no response to that assessment. He simply nodded, gathered up his presentation materials, and walked away toward his truck and trailer full of construction supplies that would no longer be needed. As the sound of his truck disappeared down the gravel driveway, Emma and I found ourselves alone with Dad and the few relatives who had chosen to stay and help with cleanup. The property looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but everything about the Morrison family dynamics had been fundamentally altered. "So what happens now?" Dad asked, echoing Emma's earlier question, but with a tone that suggested he was finally ready to treat his daughters as equal partners in family decision-making. Emma and I looked at each other, and I could see that she was thinking the same thing I was. For the first time in our lives, we had the power to shape our family's future rather than just react to decisions that other people made for us. "Now, we figure out how to move forward as equal partners," I said. "The three of us will make decisions about the property together, with each of us having an equal voice and an equal vote. And if Jake can't accept that arrangement?" Dad asked. Emma's response surprised me with its firmness. "Then we'll exercise our legal right to force a sale of the property and each take our share of the proceeds. The choice is his." 6 months later, Emma and I were back on the property for a much smaller gathering that included only the relatives who had supported our decision to hold Jake accountable for his actions. Jake himself was notably absent, having chosen to remain in Phoenix rather than face the ongoing consequences of his deception. The legal resolution had been complex, but ultimately satisfactory. Jake had provided the required financial accounting, revealing that Emma and I were each owed nearly $10,000 in income that he had collected from our property over the years. He had refinanced the unauthorized loan, removing our names from any collateral agreements. Most importantly, he had signed a legally binding agreement acknowledging our equal ownership rights and our equal authority in all future property decisions. The family dynamics had shifted in ways that went far beyond legal documents and financial settlements. Emma had discovered a confidence and assertiveness that surprised everyone, including herself. She had started attending all property-related meetings and had even proposed some improvements of her own, including a small art studio that she wanted to build in one corner of the property where she could work during her visits. I had found that standing up for my rights had been both easier and more difficult than I had expected. The legal and financial aspects had been straightforward, but dealing with the family members who blamed me for destroying family harmony had been challenging. Some relatives seemed to believe that I should have continued accepting Jake's treatment, rather than disrupting everyone's comfortable illusions about his character. But I had also discovered allies I hadn't expected, like Great Aunt Helen, who had become one of my strongest supporters, and had even told other family members that what I had done took courage and principle. Uncle Tom had privately thanked me for exposing Jake's behavior, admitting that he had lost money in some of Jake's failed business ventures, and now understood that his nephew's problems with honesty extended beyond property management. The most significant change was in my relationship with Emma. For the first time in our adult lives, we were working together as partners rather than existing in separate spheres defined by Jake's centrality to family decisions. We had discovered that we actually made a good team, with my financial and legal skills complementing her creative vision and her interpersonal insights. Dad had adapted to the new dynamic with surprising grace, seeming to genuinely appreciate having daughters who were engaged and invested in family decisions rather than just dutiful contributors to someone else's plans. He had admitted that he had never fully understood why Emma and I had seemed so disconnected from family activities in recent years, and now he realized that our apparent disengagement had actually been a response to being systematically excluded from meaningful participation. As for Jake, the last I had heard, he and Rebecca were trying to rebuild their lives in Phoenix. The collapse of his Oregon plans had apparently forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his approach to family relationships and financial management. Whether that confrontation would lead to genuine change remained to be seen. But Emma and I had made it clear that any future relationship with him would depend on his willingness to treat us as equals rather than subordinates. The Morrison family property remained in family hands, but now it truly belonged to all three of the legal owners rather than being treated as Jake's personal kingdom. The cabin still needed renovations, and Emma and I were gradually developing our own plans for improvements that reflected our shared vision, rather than one person's unilateral decisions. Standing on the wraparound porch that afternoon, looking out over the 47 acres that I now knew I legally owned, I felt a sense of peace and belonging that I had never experienced during all those years of being treated as a helpful, but ultimately powerless family member. The property was beautiful. The family relationships were more honest, even if they were more complicated. And for the first time in my adult life, I knew that my voice and my rights would be respected in my own family. It had taken a dramatic confrontation and the threat of legal action to achieve that respect. But sometimes the most important battles are the ones that force people to acknowledge truths they would prefer to ignore. Jake had learned that his sisters were not resources to be managed, but partners to be respected. The rest of the family had learned that maintaining harmony sometimes requires confronting uncomfortable realities rather than pretending they don't exist. And I had learned that standing up for myself was not selfish or destructive, but necessary and ultimately healing for everyone involved. The Morrison family was smaller now, but it was also more honest, more equitable, and more sustainable. That seemed like a fair trade for the loss of some comfortable illusions about family loyalty and leadership. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out,